Hi, Melanie. Thanks for joining me today. As I told you, I wanted to offer folks an overview of some recent research and data related to trauma, but I needed a way to do it that wouldn't put everyone to sleep, and that's where you come in. So I figured it might be a lot more fun to hear about data if it's delivered in a more conversational way. So are you ready to see how this goes?
Yes,
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay. So maybe you can give us a little insight from your work as a clinician. What percentage of your clients have either been exposed to trauma or show some trauma symptoms?
And I just want to say that I have been doing this for a very long time. I have worked with children, I have worked with adolescents, I have worked with the elderly, I have worked with survivors, I have worked with people suffering from addiction, and I would probably say 100%.
Laughing. That's not funny. I'm laughing because we never see numbers like that when we're
Yeah.
measuring things. So to
Mhm.
say that it's basically all of them, just kind of like it hits you hard. But it's not that surprising. I have read that when people access behavioral health of any kind or mental health services, I think they've measured it at like 90% of them seem to have some kind of traumatic past, but 90%, 100%. I mean, we're
It's a
we're
lot.
talking we're talking about everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see how that compares to some other things that we have found. So we're going to start looking globally, not just in the United States and around the world. It seems that about 70% of the population will experience at least one potentially traumatic event in this year or each year. Now, you might be thinking, wait, didn't we just say 90 or 100? Let's be clear what we mean. 70% are going to experience it in the last year. You're meeting with people who may have this trauma history that could be from years ago. So
Hmm.
that's why we're seeing 90 or 100% of people in your caseload. And also, your denominator is just people seeking out mental health care. But if the denominator is everyone in the world, it's 70%. I think that's huge. In any given year, 7 out of 10 people on Earth will experience something that has the potential to result in trauma symptoms. What do you think about that?
I mean, I just think it's incredible. I mean, 70%, like you said, is such an incredibly high number when we think about every person on the globe. And in the last year or next year, that is insane. But, in the work that I do and have been doing for a long time, doesn't really surprise me.
Yeah, I read it and I thought it does and it doesn't. Like, it surprises me because it is a huge number. And then the more I think about it, I'm like, I guess it does sound like what I've always read. Maybe I should stop being surprised by this. And yet you just can't help but take a pause when you hear numbers like that. Now, researcher by the name of Bonanno showed that when you look at people who are exposed to traumatic events, traumatic experiences, or potentially traumatic events and experiences, resilience, not PTSD, is the most common outcome following trauma. Um, the World Health Organization tells us that it's only about 5.6% of people who go on to have a full-blown diagnosis of PTSD. So to rewind, we're saying tons and tons and tons of people are exposed to potentially traumatic experiences, and 5.6 of them may go on to have PTSD. The vast majority of us show a different kind of outcome, something that looks a little closer to resilience or growth. What do you think, Melanie?
I really love this distinction because even in the work that I do, most people think if you have not developed PTSD, then you have not suffered trauma or you're not exhibiting trauma symptoms. And that's just not true. I think most people think of trauma as it relates to PTSD. But I love this resilience and this growth because even in the work that I do, I have seen this to be true. I only have a small number of clients who actually fit the criteria for PTSD, and the majority of my clients actually show growth and resilience as a result of the trauma that they've experienced. So it's a much more common phenomenon than people think. And so I love when we can highlight how people grow as a result of their trauma instead of only focusing on PTSD as a result of trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I wish more people knew it as well.
Yeah.
I think it's a way of looking at all this that is really helpful. And another way to look at it is, if you imagine, again, 70% of the world or 90 to 100% of your clients are being exposed to potentially traumatic events. Let's think of it this way. I'm going to offer a visual here. Imagine there's like this spectrum of how people respond to these traumatic events. Well, okay, 70% of the world is going to land somewhere on this spectrum in the last year, in the last 12 months. 70% of us are going to touch this line that represents all the different ways that people can respond. And each of us might be somewhere along this line of different trauma responses. What we find is that there may be a small group of people on one extreme who are like particularly vulnerable
Mhm.
to trauma symptoms, and they are particularly like hit hard by these experiences. It's a small group of people on one extreme, and there may be a very small group of people on another extreme who seem to be like particularly resilient and maybe seem less affected by these traumatic experiences. But again, I think it's a small group of people. The big bulk of people in the middle are people who are going to respond generally the same kind of way. Like
Mhm.
any normal person would respond under abnormal events. Any normal person exposed to terrible or terrifying things would exhibit trauma symptoms. So the vast majority of us are in the middle where we're going to have some trauma responses, some trauma symptoms. And not that we want them or that we like them, but it might be comforting to know that most people in the world would also have those trauma symptoms. Again, there may be some extremes where people are particularly vulnerable to to an exposure to trauma, and people are maybe particularly resilient, but most people are going to still have the same kind of hyperarousal, intrusion, restriction symptoms that we've been learning about. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I just think it's fascinating when you think about it that way. How kind of
Yeah,
having trauma be on a spectrum like that.
I don't know. When I'm confused by something, I tend to think about them in terms of spectrums, and it helps me. So I've been thinking about it that way, that most of us are in the big middle of that spectrum, and there may be a few people on the extremes. But part of the reason I think that's useful is that if somebody's having trauma symptoms, but they feel pressure or they meet someone who's on that very resilient end, they might think, well, that's how I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be like that
Mhm.
really resilient person who's hardly affected by these experiences. Folks, I wouldn't compare yourself to the person all the way on that extreme. It doesn't mean you're on the other extreme either. You're probably in the middle, like most of us. And I know I take some comfort in that.
Yeah.
Um, in many ways, it matters where you live, what you do for a living. There are gender differences. So we started globally, but maybe we'll start looking a little bit more granularly. So, first of all, PTSD in the past year in the United States is around 6.8% for adults, around 5% for adolescents. But here's what's interesting, Melanie. I know we're saying 5% of adolescents might experience PTSD or be diagnosed with PTSD. There's a gender disparity here. Yeah, okay, it's 5% of adolescents, but it's really 8% for girls and 2.3 for boys. It averages to about 5%. But if you look at this by gender, it really stands out to me that girls, adolescent girls, are a lot more vulnerable to this than adolescent boys. Did you?
I think I don't know if I knew that exactly, but I do think it makes sense to me. And I wonder, is it about the actual experience of trauma, or is it about who goes to get help for trauma symptoms? I mean, even in the clients that I see, I have many more clients that are women and girls than men. So I wonder, is it also about, access to services and who feels comfortable getting those services to which they can then be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder?
It certainly raises a lot of questions like that. We see the same disparity among adults. So women have a prevalence rate at about 5.2%. And so that puts it at like roughly twice what the percentage is for men. And so again, you might think, okay, well, we sort of know men to be a bit more apprehensive about seeking care. Or is it just maybe that women are getting diagnosed more? But here's something that complicates that a little bit. We also know some other groups to be more vulnerable. And I don't know that for them, it's that they are more likely to get diagnosed or more likely to have access to care. I mean, we see higher rates for veterans and first responders, but we also see higher rates for people who are economically disadvantaged.
Mm.
Well, if they're getting diagnosed at higher rates than people who have great access to healthcare and great access to education, I don't know that disparity can be explained by, oh, they're just getting diagnosed more. It's not that they have the symptoms more. I think clearly there are some groups who are more vulnerable than others. What do you think?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. There will absolutely be some groups who inevitably will be the likelihood that they are exposed to traumatic experiences are just much, much higher than other groups.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we have been talking a lot about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, like the rare diagnosis of that. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier, Melanie, that I think is actually the bigger point here. There is also such thing as what we call subclinical trauma, meaning
Hmm.
like having trauma symptoms but not having a trauma diagnosis. And so that's where we get into those much larger numbers, like 70% of adults, 90% of psychiatric patients. It's incredibly widespread. So much of what we talk about in our trauma courses is really about that subclinical trauma where a person may not have a PTSD diagnosis, but they're still being deeply affected. And so, like Melanie said, it's really common in her work. Melanie, do you think people generally understand how common trauma is in the world?
In my experience, I don't think they do. I think people have a very specific understanding of what they think trauma is. So if they themselves have never experienced something like that, they do not think that they are experiencing trauma or have trauma symptoms.
Yeah.
So I think these numbers, especially to the clients that I see, would really shock people. And maybe finding that commonality maybe would help people feel less alone in what they experience and what they've been through. But I think that it's really important to note that it is so common, but many people don't think that. And so I love how you have these courses talking about what trauma is, because informing people and the more information people have, I think the better people can actually deal with what they're experiencing when they have the language and the knowledge around it.
And all the more reason I think it was helpful for us to talk about it because I could have put on a page a list or a table or a graph of all these rates and percentages, and most people would have been like, "Meh, boring." But talking about it and putting our voices to it, I'm hoping can help people just slow down and really think about what we're saying. So thank you, Melanie. Appreciate you doing this.
Of course, anytime.